The death of Henry Blake on MASH was a disguised corporate execution. Millions of Americans tuned in for a heartwarming farewell, completely unaware they were watching CBS exact a scorched earth revenge against a star who dared to defect. Why did the Hollywood machine choose to publicly assassinate its own beloved creation? The sheer scale of network television in the mid-1970s was absolute. Operating without the fragmentation of streaming or cable, CBS functioned as an unregulated utility company, printing its own currency. A single primetime slot captured a third of the American population, generating massive advertising wealth for 20th Century Fox. The actors working on the lot were fully aware of these financial stakes, yet their standard contracts rarely reflected this wealth. Paid a fixed episodic rate with minimal residuals, they were not viewed as creative partners. The studio held all the leverage, treating the cast as high-priced contractors and interchangeable parts on an unforgiving assembly line. This power dynamic bred a specific type of underlying tension on every successful television set. Shooting MASH was a particularly grueling physical experience compared to standard multi-camera sitcoms. The production split its time between sound stages and an outdoor set in Malibu Creek State Park. The exterior location was meant to simulate the mountains of South Korea. In reality, it was a dusty, sun-baked stretch of California brush that roasted the cast in their heavy woolen military uniforms. Working 14-hour days in that environment quickly stripped away any Hollywood glamour. McLean Stevenson was tasked with anchoring this chaotic environment as Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake. The character was designed as a fish out of water. Blake was not a career military officer with a hardened tactical mind. He was a comfortable doctor from Illinois, drafted into a brutal conflict and completely unequipped for command. He wore fishing hats, drank heavily, and constantly sought the path of least resistance. The audience connected with Henry Blake because he mirrored their own exhaustion with authority and endless conflict. He was the human buffer between the chaotic surgeons and the strict military brass. Stevenson played the role perfectly, infusing the character with a bumbling, genuine warmth. He made the incompetence endearing. The viewers saw him as a father figure who was just as scared and confused as the young draftees he commanded. This connection made the events of March 18, 1975, hit with maximum impact. Television consumption before the invention of the VCR operated on strict mechanical scarcity. Watching a show was an event, requiring a family to physically gather around a heavy wooden console television at an exact time. If you missed the broadcast, you missed the cultural conversation entirely. There was no pausing, no rewinding, and no checking the internet for spoilers. The finale of Season 3 was hyped in newspapers as a major television event. The promotional materials promised a heartwarming send-off for a beloved character. Viewers settled in expecting a satisfying conclusion to Henry Blake's tour of duty. For almost the entire duration of the half-hour slot, the network delivered exactly what was promised. The episode was structured as a standard, emotional farewell with handshakes and salutes. The network then broke its own unwritten contract with the viewers in the final seconds. The scene shifted to the 4077th operating room, filled with actors pretending to perform surgery under hot studio lights. Gary Berghoff, playing Radar O'Reilly, walked onto the soundstage holding a piece of paper. He delivered a single dry report stating that Henry Blake's plane had been shot down over the Sea of Japan, known in Korea as the East Sea. He confirmed there were no survivors. The silence that followed was a deliberate, engineered decision by the producers. They ordered the audio engineers to completely mute the standard canned laugh track. That sudden absence of background noise struck the audience with blunt, mechanical force. Millions of people sitting in their living rooms suddenly found themselves staring at a grim, silent portrayal of sudden loss. Television comedy simply did not operate this way. The physical response from the audience was unprecedented. CBS employed banks of telephone operators in their regional broadcast centers to handle minor viewer feedback. These switchboards were instantly overwhelmed by flashing lights and panicked voices. Operators found themselves trying to calm down hysterical viewers who felt personally assaulted by the broadcast. The viewers entirely bypassed the fictional North Korean army, directing their unadulterated fury straight at the CBS network. By the next morning, the local and national press had picked up the story. Newspapers ran columns analyzing the traumatic impact of the episode. It became the only topic of conversation at water coolers and in office break rooms across the country. The public demanded an explanation for why the writers felt it was necessary to destroy a happy ending. They assumed it was a heavy-handed anti-war statement crafted by the show's creators. The truth was far more calculating and much less artistic. The executives at CBS and 20th Century Fox were engaged in a bitter corporate divorce with McLean Stevenson. The actor had made the fatal error of demanding release from his contract to pursue a deal with NBC. This was an act of high treason in the highly competitive network ecosystem of the 1970s. The studio executives felt deeply disrespected by a man they felt they had turned into a star. They could have simply let Henry Blake fly home to Illinois and recast him with a new commanding officer. That would have been the standard professional courtesy afforded to departing talent. But allowing Blake to live meant Stevenson still owned a piece of that character's aura. He could walk onto a rival network, carry himself with the same bumbling charm, and implicitly promise the audience more of what they loved. CBS refused to let a competitor profit from a persona they had spent 3 years building. The decision to eliminate Henry Blake was an active measure of asset destruction. It was a scorched earth tactic executed flawlessly by the writers, wrapping a brutal corporate termination in the guise of a dramatic plot twist. Behind this shield of artistic integrity, CBS broadcast a brutal reminder to every studio in Los Angeles. The network owned the platform, the characters, and the audience. Actors were merely temporary custodians. If a custodian tried to steal the keys, the network would change the locks and burn down the building. While the public narrative painted Stevenson as a tragic victim, the internal reality exposed a self-inflicted collapse. Far from a naive artist ambushed by executives, he had actively orchestrated his own exit, driven by an unsustainable ego. He had spent the last 2 years systematically alienating himself from the very people who were making him rich. The silent operating room was just the final consequence of a long, calculated gamble that he was about to lose entirely. The magnitude of this corporate execution becomes clear when examining the asset CBS was destroying. McLean Stevenson did not come from the traditional starving artist background of many Hollywood actors. He hailed from a prominent political family in Illinois, deeply connected to the power structures of the Midwest. His cousin was McLean Stevenson, a two-time Democratic nominee for President of the United States. He entered the entertainment business late, already possessing a sense of inherent status and entitlement. Stevenson initially worked in advertising and as a press secretary before drifting into comedy. He hustled his way into the industry through sheer charisma and an undeniable talent for sharp improvisational humor. He landed steady work on comedy variety shows, eventually writing for the influential Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. This background gave him a distinct perspective on the business. Viewing himself as a comedic mind and a creator, he actively rejected the lowly status of a hired gun reading lines from a script. When he was cast as Henry Blake in 1972, he brought this specific comedic sensibility to the role. He improvised heavily, adding small tics, stutters, and physical gags that were not on the page. The writers recognized his talent and began tailoring the character specifically to his voice. He was instrumental in establishing the show's unique tone during its critical first season. He knew his own value, and he made sure the producers knew it too. The problem was that network television in the 1970s did not reward individual contributors in ensemble casts. The studio operated on a strict hierarchy. The producers and the network executives sat at the top, dictating the creative direction and controlling the budgets. The cast was expected to show up on time, hit their marks, and not cause problems for the production schedule. Stevenson's desire for creative input constantly collided with the rigid efficiency of the Fox assembly line. His representatives and agents actively fueled his discontent. The talent agency business in Los Angeles thrives on movement and renegotiation. An actor sitting comfortably in a long-term contract does not generate new commissions for his representatives. Agents whispered in Stevenson's ear, highlighting every perceived slight and inflating his sense of indispensability. They convinced him that he was the primary reason millions of Americans tuned in every Tuesday night. These whispers found a receptive audience in a man who was already tired of the Malibu Creek dirt. Stevenson began openly complaining about his screen time and the direction of the scripts. He felt the writers were favoring other characters, specifically Alan Alda's Hawkeye Pierce. The dynamic on set shifted from a collaborative comedy troupe to a tense competitive workplace. Stevenson started viewing his castmates not as partners, but as rivals for the spotlight and the studio's affection. The network executives watched this internal friction with cold detachment. They were accustomed to managing massive egos. It was a standard cost of doing business in Hollywood. They would tolerate bad behavior and difficult personalities as long as the ratings remained high. However, Stevenson crossed an invisible line when he began taking meetings with competing networks. He moved from being a difficult employee to being an active threat to their monopoly. NBC was the perennial runner-up to CBS in the ratings war of the 1970s. They were desperate for a hit that could anchor their primetime schedule and attract premium advertising dollars. Their strategy was aggressive: poach established talent from the winning team. They saw Stevenson's growing dissatisfaction as a prime opportunity. NBC executives began quietly courting him, offering the one thing CBS would not provide: total control. The promises made in those closed-door meetings were intoxicating. NBC offered him a massive financial package, far exceeding his standard episodic rate at Fox. But the real bait was the promise of his own development deal. They offered to build a show entirely around him, putting his name in the title and giving him executive producer credits. They were selling him the illusion that he could be the master of his own television universe. Stevenson bought the illusion entirely. He instructed his lawyers to aggressively pursue a release from his MASH contract. He wanted out before the third season even finished filming. This demand triggered a massive legal and corporate battle behind the scenes. Contracts in that era were ironclad, designed specifically to prevent actors from holding the studio hostage. Fox and CBS had the legal right to force him to stay or to keep him off television entirely for the duration of his agreement. However, keeping a disgruntled, hostile actor on the set of a delicate comedy was a losing proposition. A miserable star can poison a production, driving up costs through delays and ruined takes. The network executives realized that forcing Stevenson to honor his contract would damage the product more than letting him go. They agreed to release him, but they exacted a massive penalty in return. They demanded the right to dispose of his character exactly as they saw fit. Stevenson and his legal team agreed to the terms, likely assuming Henry Blake would simply be transferred to a hospital in Tokyo. They failed to recognize the sheer vindictiveness of the corporate machine they were dealing with. They walked away from the negotiating table believing they had won a massive victory. They had secured the NBC deal, the money, and the creative control. They thought they had outsmarted the system. They had no idea that the corporate liquidation order had already been finalized. The network lawyers and the show's producers collaborated on a final script that would ensure Stevenson's departure left a permanent scar. They were preparing a master class in corporate retaliation. The audience crying over their television sets on March 18th were just collateral damage in a high-stakes business negotiation. The real target was the man who dared to believe he was bigger than the network that made him. The fallout from that single broadcast night permanently altered Stevenson's trajectory. He went to sleep that evening as a departing hero, ready to conquer a new network. He woke up the next morning as a man whose primary claim to fame had just been violently erased. The transition from A-list talent to a struggling free agent began the moment Gary Berghoff read that final piece of paper. The stage was set for a spectacular, self-inflicted professional collapse. The sheer scale of the network's victory only became apparent in the weeks following the broadcast. CBS executives monitored the public outrage carefully. They understood that anger was just another form of engagement. The massive volume of letters and phone calls proved beyond a doubt that the MASH audience was deeply invested in the show's universe. The network hadn't lost viewers. They had galvanized them. The ratings for the following season, even without Stevenson, were projected to break new records. NBC placed their prized defector in a holding deal, a golden cage designed to keep valuable assets off the open market. Stevenson traded the grueling dirt of Malibu Creek for a pristine Burbank office, but the reality was insidious. He was entirely dependent on network vice presidents scrambling to justify his exorbitant salary. These executives fundamentally misunderstood television comedy. They possessed the raw material of a charming actor, but lacked the brilliant writing infrastructure of his former employer. Desperate to keep his face public, they booked him as a frequent guest host on The Tonight Show. The electric live studio applause fueled a toxic false positive. NBC executives mistook late-night situational laughs for narrative-carrying power, concluding they lacked the need for a subversive concept to make him a star. The resulting development process was a masterclass in corporate compromise, tasking blue-collar craftsmen to reverse engineer his beloved Army doctor persona without triggering a copyright lawsuit from 20th Century Fox. The result of this compromised development was the McLean Stevenson show. The premise was aggressively unremarkable. Stevenson was cast as Mac Ferguson, an ordinary guy who ran a hardware store in Evanston, Illinois. The plot revolved around him managing his chaotic family life, including a grown daughter who moved back home with her children. It was a cookie-cutter domestic sitcom designed specifically to offend no one and appeal to the broadest possible demographic. It was the exact opposite of the sharp, dangerous television he had left behind. The production of the pilot episode exposed the brutal reality of being number one on the call sheet. When you are a supporting player in an ensemble, you can have an off day. The burden of carrying the narrative falls on the leads. On the McLean Stevenson show, there was nowhere for him to hide. Every scene, every joke, and every transition rested entirely on his shoulders. If a punchline failed to land in rehearsal, the writers didn't look at the script, they looked at him. The pressure to make mediocre material funny began to wear away at his natural charisma. The supporting cast was assembled purely based on focus group testing. The network executives watched early rehearsals through two-way mirrors, taking notes on which actors the test audiences found appealing. They fired and replaced actors who didn't test well, regardless of their actual chemistry with Stevenson. The resulting cast was a collection of strangers reading lines at each other, waiting for their cues. The organic, lived-in camaraderie that made his previous work so compelling was entirely absent. They were manufacturing a family on an assembly line. The McLean Stevenson show premiered on December 1st, 1976. NBC poured a massive amount of advertising money into the launch. They bought full-page ads in TV Guide and ran promotional spots during every major sporting event. The initial tune-in numbers were respectable. Millions of viewers tuned in to see what their favorite bumbling commanding officer was doing in his new civilian life. They gave him the benefit of the doubt based entirely on the residual goodwill he had built up over the previous 3 years. That goodwill evaporated before the first commercial break. The viewers sitting in their living rooms immediately recognized that something was fundamentally wrong. The jokes felt forced and mechanical. The laugh track was aggressively loud, trying to compensate for the dead air. Stevenson looked physically uncomfortable in the cardigan sweaters the wardrobe department had assigned him. He was trying to apply his specific, erratic comedic timing to a rigid, conventional script. It was like watching a jazz musician being forced to play sheet music in a marching band. The Nielsen ratings for the second episode dropped sharply. In the television business of the 1970s, a second-week drop is the clearest indicator of audience rejection. It means the public sampled the product and actively decided they did not want it in their homes. NBC executives went into an immediate panic. The massive investment they had made was suddenly looking like a catastrophic failure. The network interference ramped up immediately. Suits from the executive floor began showing up on the soundstage during rehearsals. They demanded script changes on the fly. They ordered the writers to make the character louder, then softer, then more authoritative. They tried to artificially inject conflict by introducing wacky neighbors and absurd misunderstandings. Every change they made only diluted the comedy further. Stevenson found himself trapped in exactly the kind of restrictive, creatively bankrupt environment he thought he had escaped. He was the star and the executive producer, but he had absolutely no power to stop the network from destroying the show. The situation on set deteriorated rapidly. The crew, hardened professionals who could spot a sinking ship a mile away, simply went through the motions. They punched the clock, lit the sets, and collected their overtime pay. The vibrant, chaotic energy that fuels successful television productions was replaced by a grim sense of impending doom. Stevenson grew increasingly isolated. The agents and managers who had whispered in his ear, convincing him of his undeniable solo stardom, were suddenly very difficult to reach on the phone. NBC did not drag out the inevitable collapse. They possessed hard data showing that advertising agencies were demanding lower rates for the commercial slots during the broadcast. The show was losing the network money every time it aired. On March 23, 1977, after only 12 episodes, the McLean Stevenson show was officially canceled. The sets were struck and thrown into dumpsters behind the Burbank lot before the final episode even aired on the West Coast. The massive promotional campaign was memory hold. The industry reaction was swift and brutally unsympathetic. Hollywood loves a defector when they win, but despises one who proves the studio system right. The trades ran brief. Clinical articles about the cancellation, devoid of think pieces about a tragic creative experiment. Stevenson had volunteered to be the test case for actor leverage, and he had failed spectacularly. NBC still had a multi-million-dollar holding deal to justify. Driven purely by financial desperation rather than creative vision, they shoved a script titled "In the Beginning" in front of him. It was a sterile, cynical attempt to clone the cultural clash comedies of the era, casting Stevenson as a rigid conservative priest opposite a liberal nun. The clerical uniform neutralized his frantic physical comedic instincts, forcing a slapstick actor to deliver heavy-handed moralizing sermons. Knowing the script was an objective disaster but trapped by an ironclad contract, Stevenson signed on, locking himself into a sinking ship simply to maintain a screen presence. But viewers are highly sensitive to authenticity, and they can spot a network cash grab within the first commercial break. The ratings for the premiere were disastrous, falling far below the already lowered expectations of the NBC boardroom. By the second week, the numbers plummeted into the basement of the primetime schedule. The network executives who had forced Stevenson into the role suddenly became completely unavailable for meetings, retreating to their offices and leaving the actor to take the public fall. In the beginning, survived for exactly 9 dismal episodes. In the brutal mathematics of Hollywood, one failure is bad luck. 2 consecutive failures establish a definitive pattern. The $1 million holding deal that was supposed to make Stevenson a titan had transformed him into toxic property. The frantic phone calls from agents stopped and industry invitations dried up. Sitting in his California home reading trades that openly mocked him, the man who voluntarily left the safest job in television realized he was now a punchline. The executives who promised him the moon were already scouring comedy clubs for his replacement. However, NBC still had a massive financial problem on its hands. Stevenson's contract guaranteed him an enormous amount of money, regardless of whether his show succeeded or failed. The network accountants demanded that the programming division find a way to extract some kind of value from his salary. They could not simply pay him to sit by his pool. They needed him on a soundstage generating advertising revenue, however minimal. This purely financial desperation gave birth to one of the most notoriously ridiculed sitcoms in television history. The executives dusted off a concept called Hello, Larry. The premise of Hello, Larry was a chaotic assembly of leftover sitcom tropes. Stevenson was cast as Larry Alder, a divorced radio talk show host who moves from Los Angeles to Portland, Oregon, with his 2 teenage daughters. The setting was chosen not for creative reasons, but because market research indicated audiences were tired of shows set in New York or California. They wanted a fresh Pacific Northwest backdrop, even though the show was entirely filmed on a sweltering lot in Burbank. It was another cynical geographic band-aid applied to a fundamentally flawed script. The production was plagued by a complete lack of creative direction from the very first table read. The writers could not decide if they were making a workplace comedy at a wacky radio station or a sentimental family drama about a single father. As a result, the show awkwardly oscillated between loud, cartoonish broadcasting jokes and forced, saccharine moments of parental advice. Stevenson was caught in the middle, trying to bridge the gap with his trademark stammering delivery. The scripts gave him absolutely nothing to work with, forcing him to rely on heavy mugging and exaggerated facial expressions to generate a laugh. The reliance on the laugh track during Hello, Larry reached offensive levels. When the studio audiences failed to respond to the terrible dialogue, the audio engineers were ordered to heavily sweeten the mix. They pumped in roaring artificial laughter over jokes that barely qualified as conversational banter. This created a jarring, uncomfortable viewing experience. The audience at home could hear a massive crowd laughing hysterically at a man standing in a fake kitchen holding a spatula. It insulted the intelligence of the viewer and only highlighted the desperate emptiness of the production. The critical reception was a bloodbath. Television reviewers across the country used Hello, Larry as a punching bag, competing to write the most vicious takedowns. They did not just criticize the writing, they aggressively pointed out the tragic trajectory of its star. Every review began with a reminder of how brilliant Stevenson had been on his previous network. They weaponized his past success, using the ghost of Henry Blake to hammer home how far the actor had fallen. He was no longer just giving a bad performance, he was actively destroying his own legacy in real time. The most devastating blow did not come from the print critics. It came from the very platform that had convinced Stevenson he was a solo star in the first place. Johnny Carson, the undisputed king of late night, began using Hello, Larry as a recurring punchline in his nightly monologues. Carson's jokes were ruthlessly efficient, cementing the show's reputation as the ultimate television failure in the minds of millions of Americans. When the man who had invited you to sit at his desk turns you into a national joke, the damage is irreversible. Stevenson was being mocked by his own peers on the very network that was airing his show. The ratings for the first season of Hello, Larry, were abysmal, hovering near the very bottom of the Nielsen charts. Standard network protocol dictated an immediate cancellation, writing off the loss and moving on to the next pilot season. But NBC in 1979 was a network in total crisis, consistently losing the ratings war to ABC and CBS. They had a massive hole in their schedule and absolutely no strong replacement pilots ready to air. Furthermore, canceling the show meant admitting total defeat on the multi-million-dollar Stevenson contract. The network executives decided to double down, opting for a strategy of artificial life support. To artificially inflate the dismal ratings, NBC mandated a cynical crossover stunt, forcing the cast of their undisputed hit, Different Strokes, to travel to Portland. The humiliation was profound. Stevenson, a seasoned comedic talent who once anchored television's smartest satire, found his professional survival entirely dependent on feeding setups to 10-year-old Gary Coleman. The network effectively held the audience hostage, funneling massive viewership into the barren wasteland of Hello, Larry, purely to monetize the child's star. While executives patted themselves on the back for the temporary ratings spike, the reality became violently clear the moment Coleman returned to his own soundstage. Stripped of its artificial life support, viewership immediately plummeted back to the basement, proving the core product remained completely flawed, unfunny, and permanently stained with the stench of failure. Working on a show that is only kept alive by corporate mandates destroys the morale of an actor. Stevenson knew exactly what was happening. He was an intelligent man who understood the mechanics of the industry, and he knew he was the punchline of a massive inside joke. He showed up to the Burbank lot every day, put on the wardrobe, and delivered the terrible lines, fully aware that the country was laughing at him, not with him. The bright improvisational spark that had defined his early career was completely extinguished. He was just a guy doing a miserable job to fulfill a contract. The network executives finally ran out of patience and excuses midway through the second season. The advertising rates for the time slot had dropped so low that NBC was losing money simply by broadcasting the signal. The crossover trick could not be repeated, and the critical mockery had reached a fever pitch. In the spring of 1980, the order finally came down from the top floor to terminate the production. Hello? Larry was canceled, joining the McLean Stevenson show, and in the beginning, in the crowded graveyard of terrible television ideas. 3 failed shows in 4 years. It was a statistical anomaly of failure that Hollywood had rarely seen. The industry is built on a very simple premise. You are only as valuable as your last hit. Stevenson's last genuine hit was half a decade in the rearview mirror, belonging to a different network and a different era. The multi-year, multi-million-dollar NBC holding deal had finally expired, leaving him completely exposed to the open market. He was no longer the prized defector. He was damaged goods. The landscape of television had completely changed while he was locked in his NBC quarantine. The gritty, socially conscious comedies of the mid-70s were giving way to the slick, wealthy escapism of the 1980s. The industry was moving fast, seeking fresh faces and new concepts to sell to an evolving demographic. Stevenson, with his cardigans and stammering radio host routines, looked like a relic from a bygone era. He had spent his prime earning years alienating the most powerful studio in town and burning through his public goodwill on garbage scripts. His representatives faced an impossible task. They could no longer pitch him as a leading man who could anchor a Thursday night comedy block. Network presidents refused to take their calls, actively avoiding an actor who brought the stench of consecutive cancellations to their schedule. The strategy had to shift from securing development deals to simply begging for guest appearances. The man who had walked away from the biggest show in the world was now hoping to book a single week of work on a daytime game show. The descent into the secondary television market is a humiliating rite of passage for fallen stars. To maintain his lifestyle and keep his face in the public eye, Stevenson was forced to accept jobs he would have aggressively rejected 5 years earlier. He became a staple on the celebrity panel circuit, appearing on shows like Match Game and Hollywood Squares. This environment requires a specific degrading type of performance. You are not playing a character, you are playing an exaggerated, desperate version of yourself begging for laughs from a daytime audience. Sitting in a plywood square with a blank card and a marker, the contrast to his former life was stark. He traded biting anti-war satire for cheap double entendres designed to amuse daytime audiences. While the game show circuit provided a steady income, it functioned as an industry trap. Casting directors watched daytime television, and seeing a former leading man happily making cheap jokes permanently crossed him off their dramatic lists. Categorized as a personality rather than a performer, Stevenson cemented his own downgrade, trapped in a cycle where needing the money made him increasingly unemployable in scripted television. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his market devaluation, the delusion of a comeback is hard to kill. Actors possess a pathological optimism, a necessary armor against the constant rejection of the business. Stevenson still believed he was just one good script away from reclaiming his spot at the top of the mountain. In 1983, a small independent production company approached him with a new sitcom concept called Condo. It was a final desperate gasp at prime-time relevance, entirely disconnected from the protective bubble of a major network holding deal. The premise of Condo was slightly more modernized but still fundamentally flawed. It tackled the emerging cultural clash of the 1980s by placing a WASP insurance salesman next door to a wealthy, upwardly mobile Hispanic family in a luxury condominium complex. Stevenson was cast as the salesman, once again playing the flustered, overwhelmed patriarch. The show attempted to generate comedy from racial and economic misunderstandings, a risky proposition that required sharp, nuanced writing. Instead, the production delivered clumsy stereotypes and heavy-handed moral lessons that felt incredibly dated. Filming Condo was a completely different experience from his days at NBC or CBS. There was no massive promotional budget, no luxurious dressing rooms, and no safety net. It was a lean, cheap production fighting for a scrap of audience attention on a crowded Thursday night. Stevenson poured every ounce of his remaining energy into the performance, practically sweating on camera to make the dreadful dialogue work. He was no longer coasting on arrogance. He was fighting for his professional life, completely aware that this was his absolute last strike. The premiere of Condo was met with widespread apathy. The critics did not even bother to write vicious reviews. They simply ignored it. Apathy is far more dangerous than anger in the television business. If the press is mocking you, you are at least part of the cultural conversation. If they ignore you, you have ceased to exist. The Nielsen ratings reflected this total lack of interest, registering numbers so low they barely justified the cost of transmitting the broadcast signal. The cancellation order came swiftly after only 13 episodes. There was no agonizing corporate debate, no desperate crossover stunts, and no attempt to save the productions. The show simply vanished from the schedule, replaced by a mid-season replacement that nobody remembers. This was the final nail in the coffin of McLean Stevenson's sitcom career. The industry had given him 4 separate opportunities to prove he could carry a show, and he had failed every single time. He walked off the set of Condo in the spring of 1983, knowing the primetime door had been permanently locked and bolted. The Hollywood machine is not a vindictive entity. It is simply a math equation. Stevenson's variables no longer added up to a profit, so he was erased from the board. He had to face the terrifying reality that his gamble had not just cost him a job, it had cost him his entire identity as a leading man. He was 55 years old, carrying the heaviest baggage in the industry and staring down a bleak landscape of guest spots and regional theater, realizing the catastrophic bill for his arrogance had finally come due. The absolute worst place to be in Hollywood during the winter of 1983 was inside McLean Stevenson's living room. While he was actively watching his final primetime vehicle, Condo, get quietly suffocated by the network, his former employer was preparing to make television history. CBS and 20th Century Fox were executing the promotional rollout for the series finale of MASH. The event, titled Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, was not just a television episode, it was a carefully engineered cultural monopoly. The network was preparing to shut down the entire country for 2.5 hours on a Monday night. On February 28, 1983, over 100 million Americans tuned into the MASH series finale. It was an unprecedented broadcasting monopoly that generated historic advertising revenue for CBS. Alan Alda, having remained loyal to the corporate structure, secured back-end points that guaranteed independent wealth. Stevenson, completely excluded from the wrap parties and press retrospectives, watched his former castmates cement their status as Hollywood icons. The true psychological torture, however, was syndication. As local stations stripped MASH reruns every afternoon, generating hundreds of millions in pure profit for Fox, Stevenson received only tiny capped residuals dictated by his outdated 1972 contract. He was permanently locked in a brutal time loop, routinely praised on the street by fans for a character the network had violently eliminated, while simultaneously hustling for scale pay on daytime panel shows. With primetime starring roles officially off the table, his agents had to shift their strategy to the episodic guest star market. In the 1980s, the king of this specific television sector was Aaron Spelling. Spelling operated a massive production factory over at ABC, churning out glossy, high-concept shows like The Love Boat and Fantasy Island. These programs were designed specifically as recycling plants for aging or struggling actors. They required a constant weekly supply of recognizable faces to play one-dimensional passengers and wealthy vacationers. Booking a guest spot on the Love Boat was widely recognized as the official white flag of a Hollywood career. The economics of the spelling machine were brutally efficient. The producers offered a modest, non-negotiable flat fee and a free cruise to Mexico or the Caribbean. In exchange, the actors showed up, hit their marks on the Lido deck, and delivered incredibly simplistic, lightweight dialogue. There was absolutely no artistic merit to the work. It was an industrial transaction exchanging faded name recognition for a quick vacation and a union paycheck. Stevenson became a regular fixture in this errand spelling ecosystem. He played various bumbling husbands, confused businessmen, and romantic leads in highly contrived hour-long plots. The directors on these shows did not care about motivation or comedic timing. They only cared about the shooting schedule. They needed the actors to say the lines quickly so they could move the cameras and capture the sunset. It was assembly line television at its most cynical, completely devoid of the sharp writing that had once defined his career. Walking onto a spelling set required checking any remaining ego at the security gate. Surrounded by other former A-listers, the holding areas functioned as holding pens for canceled series leads and failed movie stars. The studio treated them with polite efficiency, but the lack of genuine respect was palpable in every rapid-fire interaction with the production staff. The transition from series lead to episodic guest star triggered a fatal shift in his agency representation. When an actor is reduced to working a few weeks a year, the agency math no longer works. A 10% cut of a guest appearance barely covers a top-tier agent's phone bill. Stevenson quickly experienced the classic Hollywood freeze-out. Senior partners stopped returning calls, communication was downgraded to junior assistants, and eventually the formal letter of release arrived. Losing a major agency in your late 50s is a professional death sentence. Forced to sign with smaller boutique firms lacking packaging leverage, he survived entirely by scavenging for leftover episodic scraps. Without a powerful agent to protect his, quote, his per-episode fee plummeted. The studios knew he was desperate for the work to maintain his health insurance and pension contributions. He found himself auditioning for minor roles against actors he had outranked a decade earlier. The sheer humiliation of reading for a casting director who was still in high school when MASH premiered takes a massive psychological toll. He had to stand in crowded hallways, holding sides of terrible dialogue, hoping to impress a 25-year-old executive. To bridge the growing employment gaps, Stevenson suffered the ultimate industry exile, the regional theater circuit, and local commercials. He traded massive studio lots for aging dinner theaters in secondary markets, grinding out 8 shows a week for a shifting crowd of tourists seeking pure nostalgia. He lent his voice to regional advertisements entirely disconnected from his former prestige. It was a purely transactional survival mechanism, forcing him to actively monetize the final remaining drops of his fading television fame just to cover his California property taxes. Despite the overwhelming evidence that his leading man days were dead, the industry offered him one final cruel tease. In 1988, the CBS network decided to adapt the massive box office hit Dirty Dancing into a weekly television series. The executives were desperate to capture the massive cultural momentum of the film. They needed a recognizable older face to anchor the production and play Max Kellerman, the strict but loving owner of the Catskills Resort. Some executive, likely looking at a list of cheap available talent, suggested McLean Stevenson. The offer was a complete shock. It was a return to his old network, CBS, the very machine that had executed him 13 years prior. They were offering him a regular role on a highly publicized primetime show. He accepted the job immediately, likely viewing it as the ultimate redemption arc. He was going back to the network that made him, playing a character completely different from the bumbling army doctor. He showed up to the set ready to finally bury the ghost of his past failures. The production of the Dirty Dancing series was a disaster from the first day of shooting. The network had completely misunderstood why the film was successful. They stripped away the sexual tension, the gritty class conflict, and the exceptional choreography, replacing it with a sanitized, squeaky clean sitcom format. The casting was atrocious, featuring actors who possessed absolutely zero chemistry with each other. They were trying to manufacture a cultural phenomenon on a rushed television budget, and the cracks showed in every single frame. Stevenson's portrayal of Max Kellerman was completely hollowed out by the terrible writing. The film version of the character had genuine menace and a rigid moral compass. The television scripts reduced him to a generic grumpy sitcom dad hovering in the background of the resort. He had no comedic material to work with, and the dramatic scenes were painfully melodramatic. He was essentially a highly paid extra, standing around the lobby set while the younger cast members fumbled through poorly choreographed dance routines. The television critics, who had ignored him during his condo days, suddenly found their teeth again. They attacked the Dirty Dancing adaptation with absolute ferocity. They called it a cheap, insulting cash grab that tarnished the legacy of the original film. They specifically singled out the veteran cast members, noting how tired and disengaged they looked on screen. The show was a critical laughingstock before the first commercial break of the premiere episode. The audience completely agreed with the critics, tuning out in massive numbers. CBS did not waste any time protecting the failing asset. They were a ruthless organization in 1975, and they were a ruthless organization in 1988. They pulled the plug on the Dirty Dancing series after broadcasting only 11 episodes. The sets were dismantled, the contracts were paid out, and the cast was sent home. For Stevenson, the cancellation lacked the explosive drama of his MASH exit. It was just a quiet, pathetic end to a terrible job. This specific failure finally broke the delusion. There was no longer any narrative of a misunderstood genius fighting a restrictive system. The Dirty Dancing debacle proved that his presence on a screen actively repelled the modern television audience. The network executives at CBS had brought him back, tested the market, and definitively confirmed that his value was at absolute zero. The industry had finally closed the book on him. He was completely out of the primetime game, permanently sidelined by a business that had extracted everything it needed from him over a decade ago. The realization of this total exile alters a man's psychology. When the phone stops ringing completely, the silence forces a reckoning with past decisions. Stevenson had spent the entirety of the 1980s trying to outrun the shadow of his 1975 defection. He had blamed the writers, the network interference, the changing demographics, and the terrible time slots for his failures. The collapse of his final CBS Lifeline removed all those excuses. He was left alone with the stark, undeniable fact that he had destroyed his own golden ticket out of pure, unadulterated hubris. The arrival of the 1990s marked a profound shift in the entertainment industry, leaving McLean Stevenson completely stranded in the past. The studio system was undergoing massive corporate consolidation, bought out by multinational conglomerates that cared even less about legacy talent than their predecessors. Television comedy had evolved into the slick, fast-paced rhythms of shows like Seinfeld. The stammering, slow-burn physical comedy that Stevenson built his name on was now viewed as a museum exhibit. He found himself entirely out of work while watching his specific style of performance get aggressively retired by a new generation of executives. Hollywood constructs a specific type of psychological purgatory for its fallen stars. Stevenson was not facing financial ruin. He had real estate, a guild pension, and family wealth. Instead, he faced the indignity of the nostalgia circuit, trotted out as a talking head for cheap cable retrospectives. He was forced to sit in his living room, wear a blazer, and reminisce about the exact job he had actively tried to destroy 2 decades prior. The executives conducting these interviews viewed him purely as a cautionary tale, editing around the massive self-inflicted crater of his remaining resume. He was a ghost invited back to haunt his own old house. However, during this era of forced retrospection, Stevenson did something highly unusual. Unlike most actors who take their grievances to the grave, blaming malicious executives or shifting demographics, he dropped the act. Stripped of all defense mechanisms, he offered a public confession that stands as a brutally honest clinical diagnosis of his own hubris. Sitting for an interview, he finally articulated the exact nature of his 1975 defection. He stopped blaming the grueling shooting schedules and the network interference. He stated clearly and without any Hollywood spin, "I made the mistake of believing that people were enamored of McLean Stevenson when the person they were enamored of was Henry Blake." It was a devastating clinical diagnosis of his own hubris. He admitted that he had confused the power of the corporate intellectual property with his own biological talent. That single sentence perfectly encapsulates the trap that destroys thousands of careers in Los Angeles. The machine builds a character, the writers give it a voice, the directors give it framing, and the network pumps it into 30 million homes. The actor standing at the center of this massive industrial effort starts to believe the applause is entirely for them. Stevenson realized decades too late that the audience was never buying McLean Stevenson. They were buying the safety, the warmth, and the specific context of the MASH universe. When he stripped away that context, he was just a guy reading bad jokes on a soundstage. This admission did not win him any new roles. Hollywood does not reward self-awareness. It only rewards profitability. The confession was simply filed away by industry insiders as the final pathetic footnote to his file. However, it served as a stark warning to the next generation of television actors negotiating their contracts. Showrunners and studio heads would quietly bring up Stevenson's name behind closed doors when a young star started making unreasonable demands. He became the ultimate leverage point for the studios, a verb for absolute professional self-destruction. As the mid-1990s approached, Stevenson retreated entirely from the public eye. The industry had shifted its focus to the billion-dollar contracts of Friends and ER, leaving him effectively quarantined from the town that broke him. Years of high-stress industry rejection exact a permanent physiological debt. On February 15, 1996, Stevenson suffered a fatal myocardial infarction at the age of 68. The corporate response was strictly clinical. CBS issued a sanitized PR statement and immediately returned to selling commercial airtime. Exactly 24 hours later, in a bizarre statistical anomaly, Roger Bowen, the actor who originated Henry Blake in the 1970 MASH feature film, also succumbed to a fatal heart attack. The studios paid no attention to the coincidence. Local affiliates continued broadcasting MASH reruns that same afternoon without a single memorial title card. The franchise remained a perfect, indestructible employee. Stevenson's final ledger serves as a definitive case study in corporate leverage. He traded decades of guaranteed wealth for 2 years of late-night applause, fundamentally miscalculating the difference between a network-owned platform and his own biological talent. Today, the MASH franchise continues to generate revenue on streaming servers, working exactly as the studio designed it to work. The intellectual property survived, while the rogue contractor was permanently erased